My name is Shelle Stormoe. I work for the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program. And we are, if I can get my clicker to work here. Sorry, technological issue. There we go. There we go. Our job is to identify, evaluate, and preserve important historic sites around the state of Arkansas. So one of the things that we focus on is the National Register for Historic Places. This is kind of like an honor roll for important historic sites around the United States, and my office is in charge of this list for the state of Arkansas. So, of course, tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about railroad history in Arkansas. But before I get into that, I want to tell you a little bit about the National Register and how something gets nominated for the National Register. We have 4 criteria that we use. The first criteria is that something important happened there. This is Little Rock Central High School. Most people from around this area know that in 1957, the Little Rock 9 integrated this school for the very first time. A lot of people resisted the integration of this school, and so that process was a big event, not only in Arkansas history, but in all of American history. And as a result, this school is not just on the National Register, it's also a National Historic Landmark, which is a special designation for places that are particularly important to all of American history. And Arkansas has 23 National Historic Landmarks in the state. The second criteria that we use is that someone important lived there. This is former President Bill Clinton, and he lived in this house in Hot Springs from about the 5th grade until he graduated from high school. This is one of the few houses he lived in the state that has not been converted into a museum. Just about all the other ones he's lived in have been turned into museums. This one is still a private residence there in Hot Springs. Our third criteria is archaeological significance. So any place where we are going to find important archaeological artifacts or any kind of archaeological materials that are left behind. This is the Parkin site in Parkin, Arkansas. It's now called the Parkin Archaeological State Park. The reason why this place is important is because it was a large Native American city that the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto called Casqui, which was also the name of the leader of this particular city. We know that Hernando de Soto came to this city when he first stepped foot in Arkansas in 1541. And we know that based on Spanish artifacts that have been left behind at the site, and also from journals that were written by people on that particular expedition. We also know that about 20 years ago or so, they dug up in the major mound, in the biggest mound at the site, a large wooden cross, which Hernando de Soto and his men talked about erecting at the top of this large mound there at the site. So it's a really, really important Native American site in Arkansas from the Mississippian time period. And this is actually also a National Historic Landmark because of Hernando de Soto's time that he spent there. And then finally, we have architectural significance. The vast majority of properties that are on the National Register in Arkansas are there because of architectural significance. This particular house is the Rosalie House in Eureka Springs. And what's special about it is all of that beautiful gingerbread that you can see. It's a Queen Anne style house. All of that gingerbread is original to the home. Pretty rare these days to have all of that stuff still existing on a house of this particular style. And so that is why that house is on the register. So that's roughly how we make determinations about how something gets on the National Register. And what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk a little bit about Arkansas's historic depots that are on the National Register and Arkansas's railroad history. And we're going to talk a little bit about the railroad in Saline County as well. So the coming of the railroad was a big event in Arkansas history, and really in American history in lots of ways, because it completely changed the way that we made decisions about things like where to put our cities, or how we moved things across the country. So it had a huge impact on the way that we functioned in the United States. The first rail line in the United States was established in 1828. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad began operating its first passenger train there. And very much like today, a lot of people were terrified of the train at this time. It seemed to them like almost like a monster in many ways. A lot of people were unhappy about trains because they felt like they already crowded cities. They made that crowding worse. People had never seen technology like this before. And so for a lot of people, this was a kind of frightening piece of technology, just like we have technology today that is occasionally a little bit scary. In Arkansas, we did not get trains until much, much later. Kind of the first setup, and when people began to decide that we were going to try to get trains in Arkansas, started before the Civil War. That's when Captain Joshua Barney was ordered to the state by the Secretary of War to try to figure out how to get a railroad line from St. Louis to the Red River. The Red River was important not only as a boundary between the United States and Mexico, and Texas at that time, but also because of the use of the Red River to move things like lumber and things like that. So it was an important transportation hub. And so that's why that particular route was important at the time. The first railroad line in Arkansas was the Mississippi-Washita Red River Railroad. It got its charter in 1852. That railroad and the Memphis and Little Rock Railroad laid the only track in the state before the Civil War. The Mississippi-Washita Red River Railroad only had about 7 miles of track before the Civil War. The Memphis and Little Rock Railroad only had about 30 miles of track from what we now call West Memphis toward Little Rock. Unfortunately, that's where rail line development stopped in Arkansas because the Civil War broke out. One of the things that was important when creating a railroad company was the issuing of a charter. The state had to issue a charter to give a company permission to use the land to create the actual rail line itself. That was just the first step. Then they had a lot of other steps that they had to go through. First, they had to get investors once they got that charter, people who wanted to invest in the rail line. Then they had to actually survey and figure out where that railroad line was going to go. They had to hire their labor. They had to prepare the roadbed, which was a pretty labor-intensive process. They had to construct bridges and tunnels, and for a lot of rail lines, this was the thing that caused them to be slow in their development. Those bridges and tunnels were difficult to build. It took a lot of money and time. They had to ballast the track, which meant that they had to have a source of gravel or broken stone so that they could lay that ballast down on the track itself to create stability. How many of you have ever heard of the Bald Knob in Arkansas? Ever heard of Bald Knob, Arkansas? Well, there was actually a Bald Knob there at one time. Unfortunately, when they began the process of building railroads, they destroyed it for ballast. So the Bald Knob itself is now under rail lines all across that part of Arkansas. Once they did that, they had to lay the track, and then they had to begin connecting the track with already existing rail lines. So it was a long, involved, very expensive process to start a rail line company. Railroad construction was an extremely hard and dangerous job. Many people died in the process of creating railroads in Arkansas. Also, because labor standards were different, we had things like children working in these very dangerous jobs and doing things like laying explosives inside tunnels and running. Once they started it, children were picked for that particular job because they were considered to be faster and quicker than adults were. There are a number of rail lines in Arkansas that actually, and this is a little bit morbid, but actually have dead workers buried under the tracks, because in many cases, if they died in the process of working, it would be very difficult to move their bodies out of the area, and so they would bury them right there under the rail line itself. When the Civil War broke out, across the entire South, and not just in Arkansas, the development of rail lines stopped. A lot of that, of course, was how dangerous it was to continue building rail lines during the war. The other part was that the rail lines were constantly changing hands. The Confederates and the Union were constantly kind of fighting over who had control of the rail lines, because having control of the rail line meant that it was much easier to move equipment, to move people, and things like that. Of course, near the end of the Civil War, while Sherman was making his march to the sea across Georgia, many rail lines in the South were destroyed. And so it wasn't until well after the Civil War was over that rails really began to develop in Arkansas in any kind of substantial way. By 1871, there were 86 railroad companies chartered in Arkansas, which meant that the state had given away 86 charters, but they were controlled by fewer than 20 people. This was the time of the robber baron, and this was true not just in railroads, but in other kinds of businesses as well, like steel and things like that. The robber barons essentially were very wealthy people who controlled essentially what would end up being large portions of land, or in this particular case, they controlled all of the railroads, but very few people actually had that power, which meant that the money was going to a very small number of people as well. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do kind of an overview of the different railroads in Arkansas and when they got here and where they were and things like that. So the first one was the Iron Mountain, the St. Louis and Iron Mountain Railroad. And this particular railroad was started in Missouri in order to move iron from the iron mines in Missouri out of the state. Prior to that, the only way to move the iron out of the iron mines was by wagon. You had to put the iron in the wagon, take it 40 miles to the river, put it on a boat, and that was really the only way to transport it. So this particular rail line was started as a way to move iron more easily. The Iron Mountain Rail Line was the first rail line to cross the entire state of Arkansas, and it went roughly catty-corner across the state. That line is not an exact showing of exactly where the rail line was, but it gives you a rough idea. What it did was it followed the old Southwest Trail. Have any of you ever not heard of the Southwest Trail? There are a lot of people who've heard of it and a lot of people who haven't. But the Southwest Trail was essentially the major route that people took through Arkansas down towards the Red River prior to the major settlement in the state and prior to statehood. And so this particular rail line followed that roughly. And of course it came right through Saline County as well. First rail line was the St. Louis and Iron Mountain Railroad. It went through Bryant and eventually Traskwood in the early to mid 1870s. Traskwood's depot was established about 1876. Bryant was established a couple of years before that. Unfortunately, we don't have any photographs of those early depots, but we do have some pictures of the tracks in Bryant in the 1840s, or in the 1940s, I'm sorry. So it really was quite a while after the end of the Civil War before those rail lines really started to spread. This is an Iron Mountain Depot in Glenwood in Pike County, built in 1910. One of the things about the Iron Mountain depots is that they did not follow a particular style of depot. Their depots were different in every town. Whereas many rail companies actually, sort of as a branding method, would build all of their depots to look the same. It's kind of like how you go into a town now and you know that that building is a McDonald's over there. It's kind of the same concept. They would build their depots in a particular style so that you would know that that was their particular line. You would know which rail line you were looking at. But the Iron Mountain didn't do that. The next rail line in Arkansas was the Missouri and North Arkansas line, which was connected to ultimately the St. Louis and San Francisco line. This was a line in northwestern and northeastern Arkansas. The Missouri and the North Arkansas line was the most expensive rail line to build in the state, and that's because it went through the Ozarks. The Ozarks were extremely, difficult to get through. Laying of the track meant there was going to be a lot of blowing up of mountainsides and building of tunnels and things like that. So it took a very long time for this particular rail line to get through northern Arkansas because it was so expensive and difficult to lay the track. Rock Island actually started in Rock Island, Illinois in the 1840s. Unfortunately, the man who initially was beginning the Rock Island Company was murdered just about 6 or 7 months after the initial meeting for the Rock Island line, and so it was delayed quite a bit. And it didn't get to Arkansas until 1902. And this is a Rock Island depot in Lone Oak. This is an example of the kind of branding with their style that I was talking about before. Rock Island depots have this sort of Mediterranean look with the tile roof on it, as you can see, sort of the red brick, that sort of thing. They kind of have that look to them. The Cotton Belt was a short line in Arkansas that got its name from its main purpose, which was to transport cotton out of the South to markets around the country. It became part of the larger Southern Pacific Rail line, which went through the South and all the way out to California ultimately. One of its major stops in Arkansas was Pine Bluff. And Pine Bluff, if you have been there to the Railroad Museum, you know that there's quite a large rail yard in Pine Bluff. And it was kind of a sort of hub point for many of the railroads, including the Cotton Belt and the Southern Pacific. The St. Louis and San Francisco was often called just the Frisco because that's where it went to, was San Francisco. Feeder lines from the Frisco ran through northwestern and northeastern Arkansas, starting mainly in the 1880s. This really brought a lot of jobs to the Ozarks, an area that was low on jobs, didn't have a whole lot of industry and things like that. But the rail line brought things into this very isolated part of the state that otherwise wouldn't have had them. Missouri Pacific is maybe the most famous rail line around the United States because it lasted the longest. It's been around for a very, very long time. This is probably the most well-known Missouri Pacific station in the state. This is Union Station in Little Rock, built between 1906 and 1911. It's still used for passenger rail today. It's one of the few passenger depots still in existence in Arkansas. We have a couple of them in the state, and this is one of them. The Union Pacific Rail Yard in Pine Bluff I mentioned previously, and what I find really interesting about this photograph is, especially for people who don't know very much about trains, is this rounded sort of semicircular building that we've got right here. That was a building that was used to work on the trains. It was kind of like a train garage. It's built in that format so that the trains could be brought in on one side and easily turned around. The Union Pacific Rail Yard in Pine Bluff, as I mentioned before, was a major hub in the state of Arkansas. And today that is where the Arkansas Railroad Museum exists. So One of the things that happened in Arkansas was that much of the landscape in the state really began to change because of the rise in railroads. A lot of things really made a big difference. One of them was immigrants. Many of the rail companies actually recruited immigrants to come to Arkansas, partially to get more passengers, paying passengers on their trains, because the more people you have in these small towns that you pass through, the more passengers you're going to get eventually. So it was kind of like developing their own customer base. Many of these immigrants came from places like Germany. Some of the rail lines, in fact, actually brought German immigrants over, gave them jobs on the rail line, either building railroads or working on the trains themselves. One of the areas in the state that had a lot of this was the area around Stuttgart. These are some German immigrants arriving by train to Stuttgart in the early 20th century. Another part of the state that had a lot of German immigrants that were brought in by rail companies is Conway County and Pope County. The town of Atkins, for example, had a lot of German immigrants that were brought in specifically by the train companies who worked with the Catholic Church. Many of the German immigrants that came in were Catholic rather than Lutheran, so they were kind of a minority in Germany, and so they worked directly with the Catholic Church to bring them over, to give them jobs, and to set up communities around the area. So the Catholic Church in Atkins, for example, owes all of its existence directly to this particular group of immigrants that were coming in from Germany at the time. There were also immigrants coming in from Italy and places like that. The Italian immigrants didn't work so much on the trains as they did in farming in areas where trains would pass through. This is a Rock Island depot in Weldon, built in 1913. You can see, again, with the Rock Island, it doesn't have a particular look or style. But a lot of these towns that we're talking about now wouldn't have existed without the railroads, and a lot of towns that did exist vanished because of the railroads. For example, Camden still exists, but Camden had to completely change its entire industry in order to maintain its functions in the state. It was a river town, and the river was the way that the vast majority of transportation happened in the state prior to the railroad. But once the railroad came through, that became less and less important. And so many towns either had to shift their entire economies and industries towards something related to the railroad, or they disappeared altogether. And we have quite a number of towns in the state that disappeared altogether, like Lewisburg, which used to be the site of what is now Morrilton. Lewisburg is closer to the river, about a mile closer to the river from where the town of Morrilton is now. But when the train came through, Lewisburg assumed that the rail line would come through there because it was the main route, and they had always been the main route. So rather than give the rail line $1,000 to come through their town, they said, you'll come through anyway. And the rail line said, no, we're not going to do that. And so what they did instead was they put the line about a mile away from Lewisburg. The entire town of Lewisburg picked up and moved, became the town of Morrilton, and the town of Lewisburg does not exist anymore. The only thing that's left is an old cemetery and one house prior to the railroad time. Other towns had the exact same issue. The town of Belleville, for example, in Yell County, they literally moved the entire town. They put all of the buildings up on rollers and used horses and hauled the entire town about a mile down to where the railroad track was. So the original site of Belleville is now, there's really nothing there anymore, and where it is now is right up against the rail line. So a lot of towns did that very same thing. On the other hand, newer towns were created because of the rail line. Towns like Beebe, for example, really didn't have any kind of population at all until the railroad decided to put a depot there. And once the depot was created, a town sprung up around the depot and became the town of Beebe. In Saline County, the town of Traskwood has the same story. Traskwood was quite a little bustling town in the days of the railroads. There were a number of businesses there. There was a train depot there. And prior to the existence of the train depot, there really wasn't anything at the site of Traskwood. And we're going to talk a little bit about what happened when the trains fell out of favor to Traskwood in just a minute. Many of the trains became sort of the center of social life for a lot of small towns, especially those that were particularly isolated, like Leslie, Arkansas, for example. Leslie's still pretty isolated today, but when the trains came through, that was sort of a weekly event. People would show up at the depot, even if they didn't have anybody on the train, to watch the mail come in, to talk to new folks, to see who was coming to visit, things like that. And so the train really became the center of the town along with the depot. The depot became a very important spot in many of these very isolated little towns. The mail was very important. I love this picture because it shows what they're doing with the mail. They've got all these big mail carts, and then they've got a little contraption underneath here that moves the mail out so that it can be sorted. And the mail was really important. For the first time, the mail could actually move pretty quickly. You didn't have to wait 3 or 4 months to get a letter. And so this kind of sped up society in general, because you could get your mail relatively quickly with the train in a way that you never were able to do that before. Many of the towns actually who had trains that came through, or new towns that were built near trains, would actually orient their entire town towards the train. So the town of Belleville that I mentioned before, when it was originally built a mile away from the site where it is now, it was more like a standard town with a regular squared off kind of structure. But when the train came through, they reoriented the entire town when they moved it to face the train tracks. And so a lot of these towns, you will see these buildings that actually face directly to the train tracks or directly into the depot. And the reason why they did that was because if a train stopped and they had a little bit of time for people to get off the train and do things, they wanted them to see their businesses. They wanted them to see the hotel that was right there next to the tracks. They wanted them to see the Five and Dime, like the Dantes that you see here in the photograph, so that they could come over and buy things. Nowadays, when we think about things being near train tracks, we think about the noise. And how annoying that is, and you don't want to live next to train tracks because of the noise and things like that. You wouldn't want to stay in a hotel next to the train tracks. But back then, that was the most important financial place to be, because you got the eye of the passengers who were coming through your town. Trains also allowed parts of Arkansas to become important tourist sites in ways that they would not have been able to do if it weren't for the trains. Places like Montanay, which was a major resort, especially for particularly wealthy people in Arkansas, would not have become as popular as they had if it hadn't been for trains. Montanay had its own train line, for example. People would get on the trains, go up to Montanay, the trains would back up and go back down into town, and so the whole train line was just to bring people up to Montanay. Other places like Hot Springs really developed because of train lines. Hot Springs, if you think about trying to get there without a car and without a train, it's kind of difficult if you're trying to figure out how to walk there or take a wagon there. It's not the easiest place to get to in the world. But if you have a train, it's nice and easy. You can be in Little Rock, hop on the train, get to Hot Springs by mid-afternoon, and have a lovely time at the bathhouses or whatever it is that you happen to be doing. So the trains really did bring tourism to Arkansas for the first time in a way that never would have been able to do without them. Trains also were important in everyday lives. This is soldiers going off to the Mexican-American War in 1906, passing through Stamps, Arkansas. Many people, all the way up to the Vietnam War, got on trains to go off to war and things like that. So trains were really important to everyday life, and in some ways they made life easier than they are now. For example, there was a train line that went from Fayetteville up through Springdale and Rogers, and so if you lived in Springdale, you could get on the train and go to Fayetteville and take classes at the university and then get back on the train in the afternoon and it could take you home. Whereas now you have to fight all the traffic. It's a lot, you know, it was actually easier to take the trains than it would be to deal with the car situation like we have now. One of the major important things about rail lines in Arkansas were the jobs that it brought. And still, there are a lot of people in Arkansas that still work in rail lines, but a lot of people don't know what people do. You think of the conductor, we all know what the conductor does, and that sort of thing, but we don't always know what the other kinds of jobs were on the rail lines. So these are just the major ones. You have the locomotive engineer. His job is to make sure that the train runs, that the engine is in good shape. He is making sure that everything is functioning as it should. The fireman, for a train that was a steam engine, as opposed to an engine run by gasoline or electricity, a steam engine's fireman's job was to put wood or coal into the engine to keep it running and to not let it overheat, things like that. That could be a big problem. The brakeman's job was to attach and detach the cars from one another. So if you really look at a train and pay close attention to it, you can actually see what he's doing here. If you look at this picture pretty well, you can see it's got this kind of wheel that's attached, and that's what he would use, get up on top of the train car to use to attach and detach the cars from one another. The switchman's job was to make sure that the trains didn't run into each other. You have to have a good idea of where a train is coming. So the switchman would be the person to switch the tracks over. So if two trains were coming on the same track, they wouldn't crash. One would go off on an alternative track and that sort of thing. Dispatcher's job was to make sure that everything was running smoothly, that the train was running on time. He sat in an office for the most part, and I say he deliberately. There were no women that worked as dispatchers up until many years later. The station master's job was to sell tickets, to oversee the station, make sure all of the waiting passengers were comfortable, that sort of thing. And then finally, we have the conductor, and the conductor is the boss of everybody. The conductor's in charge. He is in charge of the train. We think of the conductor as being the person who just takes the tickets when you get on the train, but actually the conductor is the boss. He is the one who is making sure that everybody is doing their job properly. Now, women, in the very early days of railroading, there were no women that worked in railroading. The only way that they would have worked in railroading prior to World War I would have been to be models for advertisements and things like that. Eventually, by the time World War I rolled around, women started working in clerical positions inside train depots, and then eventually they began doing harder work, like laying track, like these ladies are doing. And I love this picture because you can see this is like early pants for women, right? They've got their pantaloons on. You can see how big and fluffy they are. This lady's still wearing a skirt, but they're out there doing the same work that men would have done. Other women worked as coppersmiths or metalsmiths and other kinds of functions, and that's what this woman is doing. She's got on a leather apron to keep that hot metal from burning her clothes. She's got a mask there on at the top of her head. When World War II rolled around, just like in other industries in the United States, women began working in many, many more railroading functions. They began to have jobs like brakemen and switchmen and things like that. And you can see the change from this photograph in the very early days to these photographs and the kinds of jobs that they were doing, but also what they wore, the kinds of tools that they have in their hands, and that sort of thing. Mining was particularly important to the rail lines, and it still remains so today. There are a number of areas in Arkansas that had mining operations going on, and so and they're usually in pretty isolated areas, and without rail lines, spur lines of some sort, they would not have been able to get that material out. And one of the places right here in Saline County that relied on the rail line, of course, is the town of Bauxite. Bauxite is where at one point we got 97% of our bauxite, which we use to make aluminum in the United States, not just in Arkansas, but around the entire country. And so those rail lines moving that bauxite out was very, very important to that particular industry. Timber at one point was the major industry in Arkansas, and a lot of rail companies would make rail lines that went out into the forest to basically lumber camps. Many of those lumber camps ultimately became towns over time. The line would go out to the lumber camp, they would load the lumber onto the train, which would then take it to a sawmill somewhere in the area. They would saw the lumber up, put it back on the train, and then take it out to market. And this wouldn't have been possible, this kind of scale of lumbering wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't have been for the rail lines themselves. I mentioned the sawmills. A lot of these were just kind of on the side of the road in the middle of the forest, right next to the train lines. They would use horses and oxen, and that's what these guys are right here, to pull the trees from outside into the forest up to where the rail lines were and then load them onto the trains, and that's how they did that. The rail lines were also really important in promoting new crops in Arkansas. Northwest Arkansas nowadays, when you think Northwest Arkansas, what industry do you think of nowadays? Chickens, yes. What else? Anything else? Walmart, right. Chickens and Walmart, right? Well, it used to be apples. The biggest industry in Northwest Arkansas for a very long time, from about statehood until the great apple die-off in the early 20th century, apples were a major important industry there, and a lot of those apples were planted as a result of encouragement by the rail lines. They needed to have something to haul. Right? They needed to have customers who are going to pay them to haul things off to market. And so they would encourage different kinds of crops. They would encourage farmers to experiment with different kinds of crops so that they would have something to actually put on the trains. Apparently Northwest Arkansas was, up until the early 20th century, kind of the ideal place to grow apples, and it became a very important apple growing area, kind of like Washington State is now. If you've ever been to Washington State, you know apples are really important. Unfortunately, there was a blight that came in the early 20th century and wiped out the entire apple crop. All the apples were gone, and so they had to come up with a new crop. And so at this point, the trains were less important, and what was more important were trucking companies. And the trucking companies began to encourage people to raise chickens. And so that is why we have chickens instead of apples in Northwest Arkansas now. The railroads during the Great Depression were really important for people who were suffering. The great stock market crash of October 29th, 1929 started the Great Depression, and many people around the United States were out of work. Many people say around 25% of the entire population of the United States was out of work. The state of Arkansas went bankrupt. There were a lot of people who simply could not support themselves, and so people began to migrate to places where they had heard there were jobs. And a lot of that migration was coming from places like Arkansas and Oklahoma into places like California. And in order to get there, you had two ways to get there. You walked, well, three. You walked, which walking to California doesn't sound like a very good thing to do or much fun to me personally. Or you drove if you happen to have a car, if you happen to have the money to have a car, or you hopped a train, and you did that illegally. Many people found themselves living in pretty rough conditions like this. Actually, what was interesting to me about the beginning of the Great Depression is that a lot of people who were living in the cities and who lost their jobs thought, you know what, we'll move to the country. The very least we can do is grow our own vegetables and feed our families. But then they got there and realized that they couldn't do it. They either didn't have enough access to the right materials, or they couldn't get seed, or the weather wasn't cooperating with them because there were terrible floods and droughts during this time as well. And so that a lot of these people kind of migrated twice. They went from the city to the country in Arkansas, and then left the country and went off to California and places like that. I find this photograph to be really ironic in lots of ways, because you have this advertisement for the train, right? That's the way to go. Take the train, relax, enjoy yourself. And you've got these poor guys who can't afford the train, who even if they wanted to, couldn't afford a seat, a relaxing seat on the train. So what they did was they hopped freights. A lot of these guys, as you may know, are called hobos, and that word comes from the Civil War era. A lot of people think that it refers to a phrase that soldiers would say when they were on their way home at the end of the Civil War. They were homeward bound, and so that's where hobo came from. They did this because, for the most part, if they didn't get caught, it was free transportation. They could get across the entire country that way, especially if they were single men traveling and looking for work. This was a viable alternative for them in terms of transportation. It wasn't just adults who were doing this either. There were about 250,000 homeless teenagers during the Great Depression in the United States. Many of them homeless because their families simply could not afford to feed them anymore, and they kicked them out. So these kids had to find a way to take care of themselves. So they would hop trains and do just like the adults did, ride California jobs. And then we come to the time period after the rails. And after the rails, once again, the environment around us began to change because of the way that we transported ourselves. And for the most part, that was now by car. I love this. This is the Climber automobile that was actually manufactured in Little Rock, Arkansas. The Climber was manufactured specifically to take really rough roads like in the Ozarks, which is why it was built here, because it could be tested out here. You can actually see this at the Car Museum on Petit Jean Mountain these days. And so once cars became cheap enough and roads became good enough, the train began to become less and less important in our communities. Places like the town of Traskwood went from thriving railroad-focused towns to places that had practically disappeared. And Traskwood today is a place, but it's not really a town in the way that we kind of think of a town or define a town in the same way. And so Traskwood went from not existing to existing because of the rail line to not being next to a major interstate, and so therefore not having the transportation coming through. And the exact same thing happened when the interstates were built. Whole towns moved, whole communities died off because suddenly the transportation lines were in different areas. We still have some transportation passenger rail lines in Arkansas. The most famous one is the Arkansas-Missouri Railroad, which you can get on in Van Buren, Arkansas, and travel through the Ozarks and take a nice little afternoon route into Missouri and back if you like. This is really mainly focused on kind of tourism type stuff. This particular rail line, though, still does do some freight stuff. They still are, hauling freight and equipment and things like that. But this is one of the rare passenger lines. We do have Amtrak that comes through Arkansas, comes through Little Rock. There's one other one in South Arkansas, and I'm forgetting the name of the town that it stops in now. But we do have a little bit of passenger rail still left in the state. A lot of these depots, when the rail lines began to disappear or become less important for passenger freight, had to become something else. We had to do something with them. Otherwise, we would lose a portion of our history that was really, really important to the way the state developed and why the state developed the way that it did. So a lot of towns in Arkansas have begun to preserve their old depots for various purposes. This is a Missouri Pacific depot in Helena, and remember I mentioned before that those companies like to have particular style. Again, Missouri Pacific, always with the red brick and the clay roofs and things like that. This particular depot has been turned into a museum, and it's now part of the Delta Cultural Center, which is part of the agency that I work for, where it's a sister agency of ours. We're under the Department of Arkansas Heritage, and the DCC is under them as well. So this one has been preserved and turned into a new purpose, and that's what a lot of towns have done with their depots. This is another one in Hot Springs that's used for events and things like that. Again, it's got that standard Missouri Pacific kind of style and look to it. This is a different Missouri Pacific type of depot. This one's in Ozark. This was a community center now. The reason why this one looks so different is because it didn't start out as a Missouri Pacific. It became one later on, but also local materials were important. They wanted to make sure that their depots looked as similar as they could, but if you had local materials that were easier and cheaper to get, that's what you were going to go with. And so that's why this one looks a little bit different, because they could get that stone a lot easier in Ozark than they could that red brick. We have places like the Choctaw Route Station, which was built by the Choctaw, Oklahoma and Gulf Railroad. This particular depot is now the Clinton School for Public Service in downtown Little Rock. They've completely remodeled it and turned it into a totally different purpose. And the railroad bridge that is right next to it is now a walking bridge and biking bridge that you can walk across the entire river if you want to. So why should we preserve these old depots if we're not using them for the same purposes that we were using them before? And the main reason we think that they're important to preserve and to save is because they tell a story that we would not be able to tell in the same way without them. These tell a story about why towns are where they are. They tell a story about the kinds of ways that we made a living in the past. They tell a story about where we were going and what we were doing, that without the depots, we would not be able to fully understand in exactly the same way. They're also amazing architecture. The Texarkana Union Station is a great example of that. An amazing example of architecture that, people put a lot of money and effort into because trains were so important, kind of the same way that we put money and effort into airports these days. It was kind of the same thing. And so that is really the major reason why we think it's important to preserve your local depots. We've lost a lot of them around the state. When a community can't figure out what to do with their depot, can't afford to maintain it, sometimes we lose them, and we always find that to be something that is a sad occurrence when that happens. So That is my overview of train history in Arkansas. Does anybody have any questions for me?